Okay, well, thank you very much all for coming and visiting again tonight. My purpose in these seminars is to document. I'm gonna get the lights off my glasses here. I don't know if that works or not. I'll try and whatever. It is to document how intimately Liber Novus, the Red Book, and the Black Book journal material is related to all the rest of Jung's later decades of work. And Jung's work, Aion, researches into the phenomenology of the self is a prime, extraordinary example of this. And for decades in Jung studies, people have been reading his collected works as they exist, or the seminars, or little pieces of this, little pieces of that. And the puzzle of this material is really only ultimately held together when you really get to the source material in these original works, the Black Books, journals, the Red Books. In our initial seminar last night, I attempted to give a fairly detailed, in fact, very detailed overview of the relation between Jung's book Aion and his initial imaginative visions during the period he was transcribing Liber Novus, the Red Book. And I discussed how Jung's intense near-death visions in 1944 had forcefully returned him to his first visionary journey recorded in the Red Book and in more prolonged detail in the Black Book journals, which of course were recently published, and tried to show how that engagement led him to write Aion, and indeed to write all of his last major works, which were all statements, recensions, returning to the visions. So the Black Book journals, which were published, I think, in October of last year, 2021, are Jung's contemporaneous record of his visions and ongoing imaginal discussions with his soul, with his spirit guru, Philemon, and of course with several other figures. In relationship to the journals, the Red Book, Liber Novus, only reflects material transcribed from those journals with commentary up through about 1916. Most of the visionary material recounted in the Red Book, Liber Novus, occurred in the period of the winter of 1913, 1914. That's really the first and second, part. Liber Primus, Liber Secundus, with, of course, the additional commentary Jung added in late 1914 and early 1915 in his draft document of the text. He would then subsequently begin to transcribe over 16 years into his Red Book. And the last section of Liber Novus, which he never really transcribed into the Red Book, exists in manuscript and really only covers material through the summer of 1916. So, the journals go on from there. And some rather unusual things happen. The journals, you have to see, were his primary, immediate, contemporaneous, unedited, raw record of the events in his journey of exploration in the inner world. And much more happened in the period after 1916. Events not reflected in the manuscript of Liber Novus. And even if you have read the Red Book, and especially if you have read it carefully, I think at this point, if you really care about Jung, you ought to read the journals too. The journals, how can I put this? I see the journals as a clinical record, an incredible historical record of a man and his visions. And I use that word visions because I don't, you can call them active imaginations if you wish, but at that time he didn't have that term. He was dealing with imaginative material, which was appearing sometimes in extraordinarily visual fashion. This is evidenced in parts of Liber Novus. At other times, it seems like he was having conversational, verbal types of interactions with personages, perhaps not with as much visual material. But like in the first Liber Primus of Liber Novus, the section called the Mysterium, he clearly said it in the 1920s in a private note that these were visions. He entered into that world. So there you have it. The journals are a clinical record. And I know of nothing else comparable in the 20th century, perhaps ever, especially when this private, imaginal, or visionary, or fantastic venture is reflected then upon the 3 decades of work that followed after. Public lectures, writings that repeatedly, if tacitly, in veiled forms, reflected his inner experiences during those critical years from 1913 on through 1920. So when preparing a seminar like this, I'm always asked to provide learning goals, right, for the CEUs. The administrative stuff needed for an institution to grant continuing education credits to professional, attendees, you guys, some of you. So I gotta confess that in this series of seminars, I only have one goal: to help you better know Dr. Carl Gustav Jung and the primal sources of his life work. And, the clinical relevance, if there is one, is to understand the clinical case of C.G. Jung. This is the paradigmatic clinical case in Jung studies, the beginning point of all what followed on as Jungian psychology. His concept of individuation was really brought forth from what he had gone through. So over the years, I've really tried to emphasize this to people. Meet case number 1 in the history of Jungian analytic psychology. And of course, yes, people deal with concepts, people deal with the issues involved in, the realities of clinical practice. Meet this man. Whatever you think about how things should be, see this guy. Let's see. Let me just share the screen here just a little bit. Okay. Sure. Okay. So the Black Book journals. The Black Book journals are a most intimate and private case history. There is one early there are actually 7 of these journals called the Black Books. There is one early journal kept from late adolescence through about 1902 when he was 27 years old, which is not included in the published volumes, the 6 volumes published. As published, they include all of his journal material, including complete facsimiles of every page of that journal from 1913 to 1932. But there is, in fact, more material at the end of the last Black Book journal, Journal 7, that was not published. The editor, Sonu Shamdasani, briefly and cryptically explained why the published material stopped in 1932, and why that large section, probably 1/3 of the volume 7 material, was excluded. as Sonu put it, and this is, he says this in the journal at the beginning of the text, quote, after more than a decade, and then here I'll add after more than a decade after 1932, after the end of the material published, and that leads us up to about 1944 or so, more than a decade later, around 1944, Jung took up book 7 for notes of a different kind. Hence, these have not been reproduced here in the published volume. So look, Sonu said that delicately. But take note, there are 65 more pages Jung wrote in the final pages of that last journal, Journal 7. Private material, which his heirs, excuse me, his heirs apparently felt should not yet be disclosed. And those final pages were written sometime around 1944, 1945. What was in those last pages? What was it he would add to his journal record at that time? Remember, the Black Book journals did not include dreams or accounts of quotidian issues for the most part. The journals were almost exclusively a contemporary, immediate record of visions and conversations with imaginative personages from his interior imaginal world. And one might also ask, why did the heirs, the foundation for the works of CGU, not want that published? I don't know. I cannot say that I know this, but I can say I am certain the material excluded from publication in the journals is material Jung added to that last journal, detailing his near-death visions and visions around that time in 1944, stuff I tried to talk about more yesterday. These visions in 44, after his illness, took him back to the beginning, to his journals, to Liber Novus, and to the task that was yet not completed. And they led him on that visionary period, this reconsideration of his life story, that led him on to write Aion, the book I've been addressing here. And then immediately thereafter, Answer to Job, which was a feverish continuation, really, of Aion, spoken in a much more personal way. I mean, Jung said of Answer to Job, it was the only one of his books of which he would not touch a word, change a word. So last night, I briefly mentioned a bit about the 1944 visions and their effect on Jung, and how they directed him back to what he called his secret knowledge. The things he had felt he was, the things he felt he had never felt he was permitted previously to say. In Aion and in Answer to Job, well, he said it. He said what he needed to say. Though perhaps he said it in ways that are not easily understood or digested by many people. And I should add here that Answer to Job is clearly based on the revelatory commentary made by his soul and by Philemon about the nature of divinity. This material is found in the journals starting around 1916, and then much more extensively and explicitly in material he recorded in 1918, things his soul and Philemon said to him during that period. And again, this Answer to Job is an immediate continuation of Aion. the image of an unconscious and capricious God presented in answer to Job is a direct reflection of comments recorded from his soul in 1918 of the journals. And I know listeners, when you hear this, comments of his soul, I mean, you just have to read this material to even understand what that was, how that could be. And well, that's an issue for other discussion, maybe more tonight. So why am I talking with you about Jung? After our seminar last night, I sat and talked to a companion about the lecture. And I have to admit, I do find presenting fairly trying, especially in the Zoom format. I really enjoy being with people because then you can feel, the psychic flow of people. You can look at their eyes, you can feel what's going on with them, and you respond to it. I tend to prefer to speak more extemporaneously with that responsive ability of having an audience, and this computer steals a bit of that, although I do have a very tiny audience nearby to kick me if I get off schedule too much here. In the introduction, something was said that made me ponder actually what I was doing and why after our talk last night. It was mentioned that once upon a time I climbed mountains. Not now, thank you. But on my last big mountain climb up K2, which is in fact the world's second highest mountain in the Karakoram range, and I did that in 1986 when I was 35. Some very intense things happened to me. And they had happened when I was climbing up around really 25,000 feet. I was climbing that day all alone on a very steep ice face of K2's North Ridge. It was, it was a challenging and dangerous place. And it was not a convenient time or place for an intense vision, but it happened. It was nothing expected. What had happened was an unexpected and really unknown thing. And I subsequently supposed that what happened was what I had been seeking in my prior 8 years of crazy climbing of big mountains. And after it happened, after I got back, I had no desire to climb another mountain like that, for sure. What happened was something like a metanoia or an enantiodromia of life type, terms I later came to understand. So when I made it back home, I had a very different perspective on life. I really had a change in outlook. And I ventured into a rather interior and, one might say introverted place. And then very quickly thereafter, after I got home, through some strange synchronicities, I found Dr. Jung. So for 35 years since now, half my life, I have been getting to know the old man pretty well, even intimately. Sometimes you find some of your best friends are, well, I don't know how to put this, people who are long dead. And seeking some of those old friends in my studies, I eventually followed the people and places Jung pointed to as his old friends, ranging all the way back through Hermeticism and alchemy, the medieval heresies, back to the early writings of the Gnostics at the beginning of the Christian Aion. And I found friends, companions, people perhaps of my intrinsic tradition. And we'll talk about this in a bit, but those early writings of the Gnostics are one of the key things he's using in the construct of the Aion and his critique of the Christian Aion, or at its progression as it is. Bit by bit over the decades, the pieces of the puzzle of Dr. Jung have come together for me. At least I think they have. But the essential central piece, big piece that was missing from the puzzle was the Red Book, Liber Novus, and now the journals. And now I suppose the last piece, which I expect I will never see at this point in my life at age 70, is the undisclosed material Jung wrote in those last 65 pages of his last journal. Maybe some of you will. It might be pretty interesting. So last night I began with the comment Jung wrote 6 months before his death. In a letter he wrote, I had to understand that I was unable to make the people see what I am after. I am practically alone. There are a few who understand this and that, but almost nobody sees the whole. I have failed in my foremost task to open people's eyes to the fact that man has a soul, and there is a buried treasure in the field, and that our religion and philosophy are in a lamentable state. End quote. So personally, I've struggled mightily to see the whole. And in the stuff I've been writing and talking about over the years, particularly over the last 12 years or so, I have been trying to help others take a closer look at this soul man, who I sometimes call the old fart. Look at his life and see the whole. And it is a big task. I encourage you to it. Yesterday, I mentioned Jung's friend, the English Dominican priest, Father Victor White. This is the only picture I have of White. There aren't many pictures of him. This is Jung and White, I think probably at Jung's house in Kusla. I mentioned yesterday Father Victor White, the English Dominican priest, and quoted from a couple of Jung's letters to him. And so, right now I think I just have to say a little bit more about Victor White and his friendship with Jung. In the year after his 1944 visions, Jung intuited the task awaiting him, disclosing as, well, what called his secret knowledge, as he wrote in a letter. It rested before him. In 1945, he was on the threshold of writing his story of the end of the Christian age and the beginning of a new age of consciousness, the Aquarian age. And I tried to point out to you that this really is a task, the way of what is to come, signaled on the very first page of Liber Novus, at the very beginning. Jung saw this. He had mentioned it over the years, mostly in letters, but he had not officially made his complete statement. And he knew at that point, Jung knew, that most of what he would say would be heretical to theological sensibilities, and certainly obscure to the spirit of this time, even perhaps beyond the comprehension of most readers in his own life. And he went on to say that, his book Aion was his most difficult book. It was the one that most people least understood. And then, of course, with regard to Answer to Job, Jung met a firestorm of opposition, heresy. So in the coming task, Jung sensed, I guess, he very much needed to dialogue, hear, and even actively debate some of his views with an Orthodox theologian, preferably a Catholic theologian. I mean, Jung had had it with Protestant theology. His dad was a, Swiss Reformed pastor. He knew what they thought of him, and it didn't go well. He was looking for a person fully within the long theologic and dogmatic tradition of Christianity, which he was, talking about in the book to come. And maybe that sort of a dialogue, interaction, was a way of sparring back and forth as a necessary way for him to sharpen his sword, his argumentation for the trial he knew he was facing going forward with his material. And at this synchronous point in 1945, he received a kind letter from this fellow here, Victor White. Victor was a prominent member of the Dominican priory at Oxford, known as Blackfriars. And at this time, I should tell you, I've really tried to figure this out. I've talked to the historian and librarian of Blackfriars at Oxford. I really don't know how many priests there were in Blackfriars. The Catholics were kicked out of Oxford, because they're Catholics, right? The Dominicans only were allowed to come back, I should probably put it, in 1921. By late 1930s, early 1940s, I think there were about 10 priests there. And I have found evidence that 3 of them had interest in Jung, interestingly enough, with Father Victor White being one of them. I can also put in another side note here. I said Jung is one of the most extraordinary people of the 20th century I know. Well, there is another. I mean, the only one that comes close is a fellow by the name of John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, known through many as the author of The Lord of the Rings. Jung had an extraordinary visionary venture of his own, truly visionary. And I've dug through all of this primary material, and I found it just incredible parallels between things Jung said about his experiences and things Tolkien wrote about his privately. A lot of this stuff was never really shared, and people just, people know he wrote The Lord of the Rings. What they don't know is there are 25 years of mythology before that. And interestingly enough, Tolkien was a Catholic. His friends were priests at Blackfriars, and Tolkien, in notes to in the 1940s, wrote of his own interest in Jung. So, I mean, the Catholic community at Oxford did know something about Jung. This is all a sidelight. I'll just put it there. I said it. So anyway, White was a prominent member of that small Dominican priory at Oxford. And he was an extremely erudite, well-versed person in Catholic theology, particularly in the Thomist tradition of Orthodox theology. And more importantly, he had actually read some of Jung's writings that were available and was quite interested in Jung's psychology. The correspondence between the 2 men developed quickly, and it became progressively more probing, and then later, eventually, after 1948 or so, strongly argumentative, as Jung fully disclosed his very heretical views. And, Father White was no wilting lily. I mean, he stood up for his ideas too, although there was a point after his conversations with Jung where he really thought about leaving the priesthood. It was a very challenging conversation and period for him. So by early 1946, around February, I think it was, in 46, Jung saw this was a person he needed to dialogue with. He invited White to come visit him in Switzerland in the summer of 1946. And when White arrived, Jung introduced him around to his wife, to Tony Wolff, to Marie-Jeanne Schmidt, his secretary. I mean, he became, White became friends with these people. He corresponded with them, as well as continuing to correspond with Jung. And then while he was there, Jung invited White to his tower in Bollingen for a few days of very private discussions. Now, one must understand that very few of Jung's many students were ever invited to stay with Jung like that in his private Bollingen tower. Father White was one of the few to receive such an invitation. And I think that is a pretty good statement about how important Jung felt his conversations were at that time. And there's one other interesting point. Jung invited Father White to address him by the first name, which in that case was CG or CG. And Jung, addressed Victor as Victor. Once again, in his correspondence, in his private life, that was not so common. In this case, it was for those years. So during the years after 1945, the time when Jung undertook the writing of Aion, he was corresponding with White. And some of these correspondences became pretty unusually rare, rarely intimate, direct. In his letter to White, Jung included not only his thoughts, but also some of his dreams. And the letters give rare, intimate insight into Jung's process as he began writing Aion. And in the letters, you'll find some of the argumentation that went into the middle of this book. Anyway, near the end of his life, Jung gave his collection of his letters between he and himself and White to his son, Franz Jung. They were stored in a zippered leather binder, and Jung carefully gave them to Franz. Jung considered this epistolary legacy among his most important. And he instructed his son that the correspondence must be preserved. Excuse me, whether it was to be published at some point was unclear. He told him to keep them. Finally, after really a couple of decades of work, Anne Lammers, a very fine scholar, and Murray Stein were able to bring the volume of their letters to publication in 2007. And reading these letters does give a background to Jung and the evolution of Aion. Murray Stein noted in his introduction to the letters, through his verbal sparring with White, Jung exercised, refined, and sharpened his intrinsic critique of evolved Orthodox Christian dogma over the last 2 millennia. The material that he will be critiquing in the mid-sections of Aion. So yesterday I quoted from Jung's letter to White, written in December of 1947. And to put this in context, Jung had come to stay with Jung in 46. He had come to stay in Bollingen at 47. This is now December of 47. I mean, their friendship had really evolved quite a bit at this point. And I quoted this letter from Jung last night. I'll just read part of it again. It says, actually, I'll read a lot of it again. Let's see. Try one of these. Does that work? Or my screen's showing? Oh, I'm not. Let me turn the screen back on. I simply had to write a new essay. This is the letter that Jung wrote, December 1947. I simply had to write a new essay. I did not know what it was, about what. It occurred to me I should discuss some of the finer points about anima, animal, shadow, and last, not least, the self. I was against it because I wanted to rest my head. In spite of all, I felt forced to write on blindly, not seeing at all what I was driving at. Only after I had written about 45 pages in folio, it began to dawn on me that Christ, not the man, but the divine being, was my secret goal. It came to me as a shock, as I felt utterly unequal to such a task. I felt utterly unequal to such a task. Well, at this critical moment of doubt, a messenger arrived from the visionary world of Liber Novus to aid him. And I don't believe anyone reading these letters in prior years before Liber Novus, or at any other time really, could have possibly understood this letter. At this critical moment, Izdubar, the great god from the East, who, well, I'll tell you more. So, and when you see this, well, this stuff I'm going to talk about right now, when you see this, well, I'm telling you this because this gives context to what was happening to you. And one begins to fathom the deep, imaginative relationship of the Red Book, the journals, and Aion. So Jung first met Izdubar, the giant god from the East, in vision, and again, I'm using that word. You can change it to some other word if you have one that you like better, on 8 January of 1914 in his journals. And of course, it appears as a major section in Liber Novus. But the meeting had gone tragically wrong. Confronted by Jung's toxic modernity, Izdubar had been stricken and sickened unto death. Jung sequestered the enfeebled god within an egg. And then before the egg, Jung uttered sacred incantations to his regeneration. This is from Jung's work in the Red Book. Christmas has come. The god is in the egg. I have prepared a rug for my god, an expensive red rug from the land of the morning. He shall be surrounded by the shimmering of magnificence of his eastern land. I am the mother, the simple maiden who gave birth and did not know how. I am the careful father who protected the maiden. I am the shepherd who received the message as he guarded his herd at night on the dark fields. I am the holy animal that stood astonished and cannot grasp the becoming of the god. I am the wise man who came from the east, suspecting the miracle from afar. I am the egg that surrounds and nurtures the seed of God in me. The solemn hours lengthen. And my humanity is wretched and suffers torment, since I am a giver of birth. Whence do you delight me, my God? He is the eternal brightness and eternal. See, he is the eternal emptiness and the eternal fullness. Nothing resembles him, and he resembles everything. Eternal darkness and eternal brightness. Eternal below, eternal above. Double nature in one. Here again, let me just emphasize those last heretical words of Jung. Whence do you delight me, oh my God? He is the eternal emptiness and the eternal fullness. Nothing resembles him, and he resembles everything. Eternal darkness and eternal brightness. Eternal below and eternal above. Double nature in one. This is one of the images of the Red Book, but in this section of the Red Book, and I really should make, when I talk about this stuff, I can't just talk to you about Aion, right? Just this one book, although that would seem easy, it's not, because all of this stuff is involved if you're to understand it. So I'm talking a bit about Liber Novus here too, but I'm referring it because, well, Izdubar from Liber Novus appeared to Jung at this moment to help him. There are 34 of the most exquisite pages of the Red Book are dedicated to this story of Izdubar. It really is one of the most magnificent artistic portions of the book, perhaps one of my favorite. And I should tell you that, Jung had his draft of the Red Book done by early 1915. And then he started doing the calligraphic writing of it. First, the folio pages, the parchment pages, and then he got the Red Book, the big book, and started writing in that. Well, or painting and writing. He was doing these images around Christmas of 1915. These are all his incantations, his prayers to the rebirth of the God. And it was in exactly this period in his journal record, the time he was doing these paintings, that his soul was speaking to him an incredible myth about the nature and paradox of divinity, about dark and light. A myth that crystallized a few weeks later, actually 4 weeks later, in the first version of the 7 Sermons to the Dead, the Septem Sermones ad Mortuos, which was recorded in his Black Book journal in early February of 1916. And up until the publication of the Red Book, this is the only piece of this mystical material, or whatever you want to call it, mystical, maybe, I don't know what you call it, imaginative period. This was his revelation, the only part of the Red Book that was published. And in fact, as the Red Book appears now, the 7 sermons appear sort of as the the final revelation of the book. They're right at the back there. So with this vision from the Red Book in mind, consider what Jung now says in his letter. And he here continues reading the December 1947 letter to Father Victor White, recounting the dream that led him on into the writing of Aion. Christ, not the man, but the divine being, was my secret goal. It came to me as a shock, as I felt utterly unequal to such a task. He continues in the letter. A dream told me that my small fisher boat had been sunk, and that a giant, whom I know from a dream 30 years ago, had provided me with a beautiful new seagoing craft, about twice the size of my former boat. Then I knew, nothing doing. I had to go on with this task of the goal of speaking about Christ. Well, of course, look, a dream told me. I don't know if Jung was talking about a dream. Most of the time when he talked about his personal visionary material, he couched it in the term of a dream when he wrote about these things. And there are many of his own veiled experiences in the collected works where he talks about, a middle-aged man at the age of 40 doing this or that. And what he's providing you with is something from his own visionary material, not necessarily dream. So I don't know whether this happened in vision or it happened in dream, but it was in a vision that he had met Izdubar the giant. This is Jung before the egg that held the soon-to-be newborn God. And you'll notice in the background of this picture, the little boat, his little boat. Here, I'll show you a picture. I think I have another one. Yeah, there it is, right there. Well, he said that my small fisher boat had been sunk, and that a giant, whom I know from a dream 30 years ago, or vision 30 years ago, had provided me with a new, beautiful sea-going craft, about twice the size of my former boat. Then I knew, nothing doing. I had to go on. That's the next image from the Izdubar sequence in Liber Novus. And the other interesting thing, we've talked about Jung and Aion, the crossing of the waters of the Christian age. Gosh, I don't remember what page this is on. It's in the Izdubar section, which is around page 60 in the Red Book of, the folio numbers. You notice the boat and the fish. If you look at the illustration, I didn't really reproduce this very well, but underneath this fish, there's a second fish, a more mysterious outlined fish in the other direction. Jung in his boat crossing the Aion of Pisces. Okay, it's so called, whatever, there you have it. So, of course, it was not in a dream. Izdubar, the god whom Jung had sickened and then renewed, was providing a vessel that would now help him cross a vast Aeonial sea. And the illustration of the boat in Liber Novus is so vivid, one can almost fall into Jung's vision or dream. So after this nocturnal visitation from Izdubar, and here we're talking 1948, folks, Jung knew I had to go on. He had to make his declaration about Christ, the Aion passing, and the new God image. The secret revelation of Liber Novus, about which he had remained silent or almost silent publicly for 30 years. Aion would now become a new formation of the keynote message from Liber Novus. So now he continues on in that letter, that very long and crucially important letter to Father White. And he gave an outline of what he was doing. And quite honestly, it's a good outline. But I'm quite sure the words must have left dear Father White completely benighted. And this is Jung writing, the further writing. My further writing led me to the archetype of the God-man and the phenomenon of synchronicity, which adheres to the archetype. Phenomenon of synchronicity, which adheres to the archetype. We'll be talking about that later. Thus, I came to discuss the fish and the then new Aion, the new Aion, of the Christian Aion, the one that had just started 2,000 years ago, and the prophecy of the Antichrist, and the development of the latter, the Antichrist, from 1000 AD in mysticism and alchemy until the recent developments, which threaten to overthrow the Christian age Aion altogether. I have found some beautiful material. So look, that recension of Jung of what he was doing is a quick abstract of what he was doing in his book Aion. I guess it'd be a good outline. And he had found some beautiful material. He had returned to some of the visions in Liber Novus. Well, okay. So again, I was trying to show you how the red book material is flowing into and influencing and actually maybe motivating, infusing what Jung was now doing after his near-death visions in 1944, in writing of Aion, Answer to Job, Mysterium Conjunctionis thereafter. Well, there's another piece to this too, which I found really extraordinary. And again, this is something, without the red books in hand, you could not understand this part either. So, at this point, Philemon returns to you. Jung closes this singularly important letter from 1948, with one more image from his inner world. A dream that had occurred on the night before he wrote this letter to Victor White, and which actually may have indeed been the reason he was motivated to write such an intense, intimate discussion of what he was doing. So Philemon, Jung's spirit guide of prior decades, had visited him again in a dream the night before. And one might conjecture the dream somehow motivated his revealing letter that next day. And certainly the dream has something to do with efforts to aid his friend, the Catholic theologian, see a fact beyond the confines of his dogma. He tells Father White the dream in these abbreviated terms in the letter. I'll just read this part. Last night I have dreamt of 3 Catholic priests who were quite friendly, and one of them had a remarkable library. I was the whole time under a sort of military order, and I had to sleep in the barracks where there was a scarcity of beds, so that 2 men had to share one bed. My partner had already gone to bed. The bed was very clean, white, and fresh. And he was a most venerable looking, very old man with white locks and a long flowing white beard. He offered graciously me one half of the bed. Then a month later, in January of 1948, Jung fills in a crucial detail omitted in his first recension of this dream. The old man was his spirit guide, Philemon. While I stood before the old man, this is Jung writing, quote, while I stood before the old man, I thought and felt, indignus sum domine. I know him very well. He was my guru more than 30 years ago, a real ghostly guru. That is a long, and I am afraid, exceedingly strange story. Standing before Philemon, his guru, confronted by the invitation of laying down his burden beside his master, Jung thought and felt, indignus sum domine. Perhaps no one except a Catholic priest like Father White could experientially understand the conjoined affect and meaning of these words. A priest speaks them in the Latin Mass at the most sacred moment of the Eucharistic ritual, as he addresses the consecrated elements, the symbolic and real presence of Christ's body and blood. Lord, I am not worthy. The visit from Philemon confirmed the task. Jung now had a book to write. Destiny had given him a duty, and he humbly understood of this looming task and this burden. Non sum dignus domine. Lord, I am not worthy. So I've been talking for about an hour now. Oh, I can talk more, but I won't right now. So, I mean, I actually can talk a hell of a lot more, but let me just stop there for a minute. What am I doing? Eh? What am I doing? I hope you are seeing what I'm trying to do here. I'm attempting to show with strong evidence how very much the visionary material in Liber Novus and in the journal volumes crucially interact with the writing of Aion and his subsequent books, Answer to Job, Mysterium Conjunctionis. To understand you, one simply must meet these materials, the primal source, the numinous beginning which contained everything. Without these new and once hidden works, generations of Jung's students up until the last decade really had limited insight into this period of Jung's life, or how deeply that primal event integrated into all his later life work. Maybe I'll switch right there for a second and take any discussion or thoughts. I have actually, well, what time is it? We've been about an hour here. I have more, but let's just see. There's more I could say. Whatever, always more.
Well, if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and I will ask you to unmute yourself to ask a question. June, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, June Jelm in Salt Lake City. I have actually lots of questions, so I need to really limit. Is the new God of the New Age Ishtubar, or are they different?
I would say in first answer, no, not related. Ishtubar, in the myth of the Red Book, in the Red Book, is a god from the East whom Jung meets on the road. Jung basically poisons him with his modernity, and then Ishtubar dies. He or not dies, but is weakened and on the verge of death. In the myth, in Jung's fantasy of this period, he takes this sickened god home and encases him in an egg, and then he sits before the egg, giving these incantations, trying to regenerate the god image. And in the end, it happens. That image. Let's see. This is the. Let me see if I have that image. Where is it? Where is it? Oh, don't worry about it. It's in the. Oh, well, yeah, I showed you this. This is the image here. I'll see if I can share that again. This is the moment when Ishtubar emerges from the egg after these incantations, those pages of beautiful art. This is Jung carrying the egg, the wholeness of this ancient god who is now about to be reborn. So is Ishtubar God? No. What this is in mythic form is Jung's confrontation with the fact that it seems as if the god of the past has died or suffered an illness, and in the birth or rebirthing in the myth, I mean, this is his fantasy, he's sensing the process of something that he is actually going through himself, of meeting the divine and bringing that divine into a new reality in his being. So what that divinity is, well, we'll talk about that a little bit more, actually, even maybe later today if we get that far. Another question, June, is that it?
I do have another question.
Well, go ahead.
Thank you. I hope this is an appropriate time for it. Von Franz, in one of her later books, said that in the last visions, a statement Jung made as a result of his last visions, if he had time, he would rewrite most of his books. Would you enlighten us on that a bit, please?
Well, Jung was reasonably self-critical, and let me turn the screen share off. Sorry, I flip back and forth here. I think I'm back. So he was reasonably self-critical, and he actually did write a lot of his stuff more than once. He said, what you said, that quote from Von Franz is true. I mean, that Jung did say that. But he said, in addition, the only one of my books that I would not rewrite a word of was Answer to Job. Now, just, I'll just, riff on this a little bit. Jung was really he was a lecturer. He was a essayist, a psychological essayist, if you wish. And he only wrote a few books per se. Most of his books were collections, of essays that he gave or talks he gave that were then collected together, fused together into a published volume. And of those essays, if you go back and look, especially the stuff from, 1916 on through the 1940s, he rewrote it again and again and again, and republished it in various forms over the years. So this is really a critique of the, well, it's a critique I have of the collected works. Not that it matters what I think at this point. It's a critique that Sonu Shamdasani has also made. That if you look at the collected works right up there, lots of them, they are arranged topically and without any sense of the timeline of them. But if you look at his bibliography of what he wrote, some of these things he wrote once, then he wrote another version of again, another version of it again. He changed things in it such that what we have in the collected works is sometimes the last of those things. And if you really want to know what was going on, or if you're trying to figure out the trajectory of his understanding of himself, you would have to go back to some of the first, which some of us have done. I've done it. And some of the changes are sort of interesting. Jung was a man in progress. People think of Jung as a monolith, right? Like, he's like the old boy. He's like, it fixed, the stone, the stone. But the guy was a work in progress throughout his life. So when he says, I would have written any of my books again, of course he would have. But he didn't. No time for that. It happened. But he's aware of the fact that he was not always consistent, and he wasn't, about many things. He was continually fluid with some of these ideas, in some way, to some degree, throughout his life, except for that one example, answer to Job. And I would say, Aion is really, Aion and answer to Job are really partners. They really are wedded together in the course of his thoughts. Okay. Anyone else? Hit me.
Grace, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Grace Hogstead, and in your essay or in your article, you quoted Jung as having said, Christ has completed his work. Now each must do his own. A new month, the 4th month, has begun. Learn from the suffering of a crucified God. Now I'm wondering, I have the book, Aion, but I have not read it. I wonder if he did specify any suggestion as to how we may proceed. Now I know you have, or Edinger suggests that the new Aion will be about the Jungian psychology or his process of individuation to be the new Aion. And you also propose that the inclusion of the feminine, which I prefer myself also. But I'd like to hear from you if he specified any suggestion in the book of Aion.
Okay, that is a big question. Let me see if I can give a medium answer. Throughout the Red Book, there are a few words that are just repeated again and again. So with my digital copies, or actually, I actually went through this, trying to do this by hand once upon a time. If you look up the word Christ or Christian and Christianity together in the Red Book, you're going to come up with over 500 hits. I mean, if you look at the big folio volume, you'll find those words on almost every one of those pages. The word God, I mean, when I did a digital search on that in the Red Book, I mean, you get over 500 hits, more than the thing will show me. These issues were on his mind. This is really an issue that is talked about in Aion. And the fact that you haven't read Aion puts you in very good company, because a whole lot of people haven't. It's a complex book. So I know lots of people that have a copy of that book that haven't read it. But in the book, he's talking about what is needed in this time. And in the developing Christian myth over the first millennia or so, people were putting their salvation upon the hope of a redeemer. And what Jung was really turning to people and saying is, you have work to do. There is a redemptive figure in you. There is an indwelling Christ, if you wish to use that term. You don't have to be Christian to, I mean, you could choose another one. There's an indwelling fact within you, awaiting you. And the fullness of that is a potential in you, if you turn to it. So, Jung was critical of those who laid themselves upon the floor saying, good God, forgive me, I'm a sinner. He said, yeah, you're a sinner. Of course you are, you're human, right? Deal with it. Deal with that shadow. Deal not just with the fact that you are a sinner, carnal, sensual, and devilish that you are, as every other human I know, or at least some of that you have something more precious in you, that you have to essentially understand your animal. You have to live your animal, but you have to understand that within that animal, within that ground, there is a hidden, buried treasure. You're the field, the treasure's in you. So it's an interiority, I suppose, of the divine image that he was seeking. And he does very much talk about that in Jung and Aion. Although, good God, it's a difficult book, and I'm not going to get there tonight, it looks like, but there's more. Can I move on? Thank you so much for the answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Patrick, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. I had a couple questions. One is, in the Red Book, there is just so much soul language. And in Aion, I mean, there's a section about the anima and animus at the beginning.
Mhm.
But I have wondered, I mean, at times in the Red Book, clearly it's anima stuff, but there's other reference to the soul where I don't know if it just seems so much bigger than that.
Say bigger than that. What's that?
Bigger than the anima.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes.
And
Yeah.
so in the relation between the two, it just seems that I'm not sure how to understand that. So that's my question.
Okay. No, that's actually this issue of Jung's speaking of his soul, or speaking to his soul as my soul. And actually, this is stuff I was going to talk about a little bit later tonight about the anima animus stuff, because this is really right at the very beginning of Aion. So well, let me just actually talk about that and anima and animus just a little bit, not in great depth. Jung had said that, said it actually in Aion, it said it, but said it even before that in the book, right before that, The Psychology of the Transference, that one met the anima through a contrasexual partner if you were a male. That you projected this thing that you don't even know is inside of you, right? Until you project it. And then you don't know it's inside of you. You think it's out there on that person. I remember the first time I fell in love when I was platonic love, very platonic. Was it must have been 16 or 17, where I was, memorizing Shakespeare's sonnets to whisper to her in a summer night. Never worked. She never was interested. But I have a friend she hadn't heard this story yet. So, and I haven't whispered any sonnets recently, I'll just put it that way. So anyway, then in the projection, you think that's it. Well, this girl, I mean, good God, I probably would have had nothing to do with her. I actually knew her best friend up to this very day, 50 some years later. And she's made it quite clear to me that, first of all, her dear friend who I was in love with didn't even know who I was, more or less. I mean, you know, and second, that I never would have really gotten along with her because I didn't even know who she was. But you see, to me, I saw her. And it took, you know, when I first started dealing with this issue of anima animus, that image came back to me very quickly and how I had played that fiction. I mean, I wrote poems about this stuff when I was 18, 19. Embarrassing things, you know, when you're 70, but it happened. So you do see these things in projections, and he says that women do this with the animus outward. Okay, so in the Red Book, Jung addresses his soul, and he does say in the very first pages of his journal, after, you know, I think it was probably around November 1914, 1915, he says to his soul, "And I met you only through the soul of the woman." That part was excluded from the Liber Novus, but that is the line in the Black Book when he's talking about his soul, who he doesn't even know who she is. He says, "I met you only through the soul of the woman." And this probably has to do with his relationship, well, with his wife for sure, but with Toni Wolff also at that time, because she was very, very important to him, very intuitive, very responsive to what was going on in his inner world. She was pulling some of this anima stuff out of him. So is the soul more than the anima? Well, ultimately, in my mind, the soul is also a form of the word psyche. So take it to another step, right? So yes, there's a soul that Jung is playing with, meeting in a female guise. He's getting to know her during this period. The formation of this idea of the anima is coming to him. But there's also a soul, I mean, the psyche, really the translation of psyche would be soul. So yes, you're quite right to say that the soul is more than anima. The soul is, in fact, psyche, maybe even a totality of forms of our psyche. And of course, psyche becomes diffuse and massive because, you know, the psyche isn't just something, you know, in here. I've tried to state this, you know, several times to people. When you start talking to the psyche and trying to find where, you know, how far it goes in, you know, in you, there's no bottom. The psyche goes. The psyche is more than you, and some of it is in you. Am I catching at the issues here?
Yes. Yeah, I guess another way to ask it is, in Aion, he uses the term self.
Yes.
All over the place.
That's also in those first sections of the book, which actually I thought I might talk about, but I may not get to it entirely. The self, you know, he goes through this. This is like the Jungian psychological conceptual structure. So the self is really almost a divine image in us. This goes back to that first question. So the self is the word he continually used is complexio oppositorum, a union of opposites. It's coming to terms with the dark and the light in us and in this thing we call God, which might actually be resident in us as well. So a self is people say, well, this is a metaphysical concept. It's not at all a metaphysical concept if you've had any experience of it, and Jung most certainly did. The self is really those next 2 or 3 chapters in Aion, after the step on animus and syzygy and self, they're about Christ, a symbol of the self. And when he says that, you know, Christ, a symbol of the self, he is not saying Christ is the self or the self is an image of Christ. He's saying that in a mythological form, if deeply understood, this mythological form is a good symbol of a totality, a divine totality that we could call the self. So look, if you're Jewish or if you're Muslim or God knows what else you might be, if you're Wiccan, whatever, getting all into this Christy stuff and whatever, you can move beyond the words, and you don't have to say, well, obviously Jung is a great, Christian prophet, whatever. Well, probably not, but, or maybe yes. God, I mean, Edinger thought he was in a way. I think someone mentioned that just a minute ago. So the self is really sort of an ultimate, you could say it's a concept, but that fails to understand that Jung was saying it's an experience, a rare one. And it is known symbolically that some of these ineffables of our world are only met in symbol. And Christ is a symbol of the self. Or you can turn it around the other way you want and say the self is a symbol of Christ. Either way. And he said actually that same thing in that phrase in Aion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gordon, would you like to unmute your?
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much, Lance. I had two questions, sort of. One is kind of superficial in a sense, but early on, not a little while ago, where you had the quotation where Jung is talking about having discovered or written about the archetype of the God-man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Well, in the quotation just said the God-man, but I was thinking about Jung just talking about that conceptually.
Yes.
This that's the same as the anthropos. That he isn't. It could be called the anthropos or the Purusha or the second Adam. Those are all referring to the same conceptual image. Is that?
Well, yes, I think you could. I would think that is an appropriate statement, although I would argue with the word conceptual. I think that they're all referring.
Agreed. I'll, for lack of a better term, as an umbrella term.
Yeah, okay, well, it's a good Jungian. You have to be careful about saying things like that.
Well, yeah, I get a little sloppy with language sometimes.
You're okay. You're okay. I'm just playing. I'm playing the game here.
No, I understand, but this whole idea of the anthropos and the God-man, and
sure.
Well, Ed of course, Edinger, with the self-ego.
Yes.
That was one question. Was just getting the terminology straight. The other one, let's see if I can remember. I'm hitting.
Well, when you think about that, let me just talk about the first issue of the anthropos. This was a really big, important word for Jung, and it occurred actually in a lot of mythological works at that time that he was dealing with, and he saw this anthropos as the totality man, and you could say maybe even the anthropos was the image of the fulfilled self in a man, or a woman, or a conjunctio of something that is human with something that is divine, more than just incompleteness, inadequateness, and inferiorness of how we find ourselves at this moment. So the anthropos plays throughout this stuff. Purusha, the other terms, they're all appropriate. And when I said concept, what I was trying to mean is these are experiences. They can be experiences. We can conceptualize about them. And I think Jung very frequently would say, well, the concepts are just, well, the Latin term is flatus voce, which means verbal farts. A lot of our concepts are verbal farts. And Jung says, okay, whatever your concepts, what is the experience behind them? Because when I'm talking about things here, I'm talking about things empirically understood. And occasionally he's talking about things empirically understood mainly by him, and hopefully by those who followed after him or understood.
Well, no, really. I mean, you mentioned in passing almost that image when he, at the end of the Mysterium encounter, the
Yeah.
theater of Mysterium, where
Mhm.
the snake is wrapped
Mhm.
around him, and so
Oh, yeah,
Owens
yeah.
at his feet. And he refers to that as his Christification. I mean, and he says when he wrote about that, yeah, he was sweating. I mean,
Yeah.
it was such an intensely real experience. I mean, it's hard for that to convey that those are real experiences, that what it means to have that experience of intense unity or
Yeah.
oneness.
Well, that, I mean, that
Emotion
entire
involved.
image, yeah, that entire image comes right at the end of the, what he called the Mysterium, which was probably the most important, most intense
Mhm.
visionary period of the Red Book. And it happened in December 22nd, 23rd, 24th of 1913, right when this whole period, the first couple of months. And Salome is there kneeling before him, and she says to him, Mary is your mother, or Mary is our mother, you are Christ.
Yeah.
And then he finds himself outstretched with the serpent wrapped around him like that god Aion, and the serpent is squeezing him so hard, the blood's running from him. It was an intense vision.
Yeah. When the 1925 lectures, yeah, he gets into that.
Yeah, he said it, yeah.
The other question I had was about the book. It's called Jung in Love, or
yeah, that's it. Yeah, Human Love.
well,
It's
anyway,
called,
I was
actually,
wondering, I mean, I understand the metaphor, I think. I mean, I think I understand where the metaphor, but is this material in that book? Some of these things, especially this weaving together of the Victor White letters and conflict versus Jung, the Gnostic or heretic.
So Jung in Love, look, there are a couple of things that happened to me a few years ago. That paper I did that was mentioned, actually the dogs are waking up. That's a bad sign. the Jung and Aion time vision and a wayfaring man. That paper just, I mean, it just exploded in me. I couldn't stop writing. It just, when I saw that first page of the Red Book, it just, I knew what he was saying there, and I just had to find the evidences that I could. And the second book, Jung in Love, it's called The Mysterium in Liber Novus. Jung in Love, The Mysterium in Liber Novus. You know, there's been all this stuff about Jung as a womanizer, God knows what. It just ain't so. But women were very important in his life, most certainly. And he did have intense relationships with a few of them. And there is actually a love story in Liber Novus. That love story between Jung and his anima, his soul, Jung and Salome, a recurring figure. There is this, right when we were actually talking about stuff I was going to do in the last part of this lecture of anima and animus, the sort of this mystery of the syzygy. That's what he's talking about here in the beginning of Aion. So he was learning about the stuff he wrote about in Psychology of the Transference, which he wrote in 1942, 43, just before his illness in 44, and published just after the illness in 45, but it was pretty much done at that point. He was learning about this stuff in those years. Of course, he understood it a great deal better after 30 years of being a psychoanalyst, right? After dealing with patients again and again. So the book Jung in Love doesn't have very much. I don't think I have a word in there about Victor White. This stuff that I'm talking about, its source was stuff related to my work on that first paper I mentioned, which was Jung and Aion time vision and a wayfaring man, which, as you who have read the lecture or the paper will know that my lecture last night was very strongly based upon that paper. And the reason I did that is because that damn paper was so important to me. I couldn't restate it, just give them a lecture extemporaneously and restate what I'd written as best I could at one point. And so, excuse me, so you got some stuff last night.
One last question, talking about this anima and Salome and Yeah,
Right,
the
yeah.
various projections.
Mhm.
What about, where do you fit in or think about, well, the one in chapter 2 of Secundus, the librarian's daughter. I call her the librarian's daughter. I don't know what she really, I forget.
Is this the one where he goes to the out in the woods to the castle?
Right, and he thinks he's in a novel, and the daughter
Oh.
of the householder comes to the doorway, and he has this deep discussion about what it means to love somebody as a person rather than as an object of the opposite sex.
I think that you're. I'm not hearing this exactly, because the whole issue about when he's in the library and he gets the book of Thomas à Kempis, he goes down into the kitchen. Not that section.
No. This is right at the beginning, right after the.
Yeah, that's the house in the forest, or the castle in the forest, where he goes in,
Yeah.
right, and he goes into his room, and then he says, "Oh, this is going to be like a cheap mystery plot." And the next thing you know, a young maiden walks into the room and they talk. Well, when I was talking, yeah, yeah. Well, that's right at the beginning, and that's when Jung is working on these issues of anima and soul, and he's met Salome already in Liber Primus, with Elijah at the side. He's had this relationship with Salome. And what does Salome say? I love you. You will love me. That's what Salome says to him. And Jung, says, you prostitute, you whore. How dare you bloodthirsty cur? How dare you say I will love you? Because Salome is historically, mythically, the one who had King Herod cut off John the Baptist's head, right? So, she was murderous. But so then in that one, the castle in the forest, I think is that section, he meets this young woman again, and they have this interaction. And the young woman is really talking about, I'm not just a fantasy. I'm something. I'm real. This is part of Jung coming to terms with the animus issues in him, with his anima. And he's getting a increasingly deepened understanding of this thing, this feminine thing. He's also at the same time in a relationship with a real woman, or two, or three. And it so happens that he was definitely very much in love with his wife, Emma. I mean, she really was the love of his life. But there was Tony. It was complex. I'm, at age 70, I've come to the conclusion that life is complex, right? I don't have many judgments about these complexities. I do have judgments about how some people handle them morally and ethically in relation to each other. But, hey, love, it's hard, it's difficult, it's strange, and it's the most wonderful of all things. So I wandered on. Let me move ahead.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question from someone on the chat. It's from
Go ahead.
Wills from Salt Lake City. He's asking, would you say a few words about the numinous as it applies in Aion and other writings by C.G. Jung? What word did you use? Thank you.
What was the last word? What did you use?
What word did you use? You wanted to know something about the numinous and how it applies in Aion and other writings.
Well, the word, as Jung described it, the word numen comes from Etruscan, the old language, first peoples of the Italian land, and it meant a God image. So when Jung talks about the numen, he's really talking about a God image or a God power. And when he talks about numinous, which is a word appears a whole lot in Jung's writings, and in a whole lot of Jung speak as we talk to each other about experiences, things that happen to us. So sometimes we'll talk about something as being truly numinous. I guess that that thing that happened to me up on K2 at 25,000 feet. I'd call that numinous. It wasn't, it was one of the special events in my life at that time. So Floyd, I would say the word itself just means a powerful image of the God presence or a thing like that. As to how it applies to Aion, well, Jung is talking about the God image. He's talking about the self. He's talking about the Christ image. And he's talking about these things, again, not as concepts, right? Not as concepts, but as experiences. And he doesn't give, Jung hates the whole thought of metaphysics. He says, look, you can have all the concepts you want. They're the verbal farts, the dogmatic verbal farts, if you want to call them that. What matters is the experience that leads to the word. The concept, if it exists at all, at one point may have been part of our human experience. A numinous experience is something that comes upon us as something that has the savor of divinity. Now, I suppose the savor of divinity can be pretty bitter at times as well. It's not, you don't have to be like all happy with it. The savor of divinity sometimes is enduringly intense and hard to take. And sometimes it's just all light and glory. But those things both, God light, God dark, the dexterous and sinister arms of God, can slap us on both cheeks either way, and a slap of those things is numinous. Okay, I hope that makes it.
I had a question for you. I don't know how to formulate it, but I read an essay by an Italian analyst who was close to Jung, and at some point he had a dream that Jung was just worshiping something behind his desk. And so Jung asked him when he saw him, when that person told him the dream, where was it? And so the person just pointed. And so, well, Jung said, you're really intuitive. You have seen something, well, with intuition. And it was actually a picture of the Holy Shroud, the Shroud of Turin, which is a representation of the Christ. And so I'm saying that because when you were talking about the letter that Jung wrote to Victor White, it seemed to me that Philemon, who really looks like the figure of Christ on the Holy Shroud, there was a connection between Philemon and Christ. And I wanted to know if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, thanks. I can speak to that, and as most of my answers are, it'll be a bit long. So I think the best way to start an answer to that is with a comment that he made to Carrie DeAngelo, who was Carrie DeAngelo Baines. And this comment, Carrie Baines wrote in her journal account of her conversations with you contemporaneously that night after their conversation. And as many of you know, Sonu Shamdasani had access to most of Carrie Baines's papers, which are now in the University College London archive. So Sonu's got it all there now. But anyway, in this conversation, and Sonu quotes this conversation, this writing, in his introduction to the Red Book. It's something that no one had ever seen before until he quoted it right there in the introduction. So Jung says to Carrie that all of these figures that appeared are images of, well, not necessarily all of them, that Father Elijah in the early Liber Primus, and Philemon, were all images of the master. The same who influenced Christ, Buddha, Mohammed, and Mani, all the friends of God. So I don't think one would say that Jung worshipped Philemon. He had ultimate reverence for the thing that has come across time to humans as a inspiration, to return them to the understanding of what it was to be human, to consciousness. And Jung very much, this is part of the whole story of Aion. Jung very much felt that there was something in us, a seed of the stars, if you call it that has somehow fallen here into this world of pain, of chaos, of evil, real evil. Evil is real. And that thing is here dealing with it. And to some degree, it is becoming aware of what its source is, the bright source of the seed of light, the star in man, to use a term we've used recently in some writings. Philemon was one who came to Jung as a messenger. Why he took the name Philemon and why he came to Jung, I won't riff on that, but there may be reasons, but that's how he came. But then at the very end of the Red Book, there's a scene where Jung is walking with Philemon in his garden outside the house in Küsnacht. And actually, Andreas Jung took me out to the garden. So this is where that conversation took, right here. This is the part. This is the garden. Anyway, well, Jung is walking with Philemon, and in the Red Book it says a blue ghost appeared, but in the Black Book Journal it says and Christ appeared. So Christ, appears in the garden. Jung's sitting there walking with Philemon as he had on other occasions. Christ appears. This takes place in June of 1916, by the way. And Philemon addresses Christ, my master, my brother. And Jung, is there in the conversation. So Philemon addresses Christ, my master, my brother. And Philemon looks over there and says, Simon Magus, is that you? And Philemon responds, once I was Simon Magus. Now I'm Philemon. You see this metamorphosis of times. Now, to put that all in context, you have to understand that Simon Magus was declared by the heresy fighters of the 2nd century and 1st century, actually, it was 2nd century for sure, as the first Gnostic. Irenaeus, writing in 180, called Simon Magus the father of all heresies. And so who was Jung's master last time around? The father of all heresies. So, it's like, so would he be worshiping Philemon? No. Would he be worshiping this fact? The same fact, perhaps, that had been the inspiration of a Buddha, a Christ, a Mani, a Mohammed. All friends of God. Yeah, that he would worship. In fact, not only would he worship, he most certainly in his most interior space did. Now, with regard to the Shroud of Turin, it's a very mystical piece, isn't it? And so I suppose what one sees there is the face of something impressed upon a fact of matter that somehow is an impression from something outside of matter, outside of it. And I think that thing which impresses itself into our world, that is the thing that I think he most certainly worshipped.
Thank you. John, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, wonderful talk. Santa Fe, New Mexico here. Thank you for all you're doing.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little more about this term enantiodromia.
Mhm,
Is a very Jungian term. It's a
mhm.
it's a Jungian thing. And I
Mhm.
I get it as a cyclical kind of cosmic concept. But what I want to ask is enantiodromia also relevant to one's personal psychology, one's analytic process, one's evolution as an individual? Or is it really just kind of a cosmic cyclical thing Jung talks about? Or does it also come into the individual psyche and individual process as well, like
Sure.
analytically, clinically even?
Sure. Okay, I've got a good answer for that. And I've got an answer from Dr. Carl Gustav Jung. But let me step back a bit and say, the word, it comes from Greek philosophy. And if I was smart enough, I could tell you exactly who said it first, but I'm not. I can't remember. But an enantiodromia basically means a changing of one opposite to the other. So sometimes you go so far in one direction, like you actually become the other thing. I use this actually in political discourse. I have friends who are so damn conservative that at the far extent of it, they end up being liberals. It's just like, it's like this flip. So the enantiodromia really means a switch from one type to another. Now, Jung actually wrote about this. And he wrote about his process in the Red Book. And there's this scene there of between, the red one and Ammonius, the monk. And Ammonius is, the pure and chaste monk in the desert, and the red one is like, let's drink and dance and have fun. And the next time Jung meets them, they've hooked up with each other and they've changed views. So after Ammonius talked to Jung, he got on a boat and went whoring in Italy and fell off the wagon as far as his religion. And the red one ended up becoming a monk dancing to the glory of God. Okay, enantiodromia. And Jung talked about what had happened to him in this period of his life in an essay he wrote about 1922, not published. This is in his private writings. And this is another one of those lovely things that Dr. Sonu Shamdasani pulled out of an archive that he knows better than anybody else, really, where Jung talks about what had happened to him, and he called it an enantiodromia of the life type. Now, let me explain that. Jung had been would have described himself as a thinking sort, right? A thinker. And he had really felt like he had suppressed his feeling nature. Just like Ammonius, the monk, had perhaps suppressed his desire for society, community, love, wine, dance, women. Just starting with, for Ammonius, he was an anchorite, which means one who lives alone as a monk. I mean, just making it to human companion was like. So, what does he go off to do? An enantiodromia of type, a life type. So Jung, very much in this period of the Red Book, is coming to terms with his opposite, coming to terms with the fact he has feelings, even feelings of love that he is not taking care of it properly, feelings of relationship that he's dealing with. I mean, yeah, the guy's intuitive. Yeah, the guy's thinking. Well, what are the problems that your thinking intuitives have? Sensates and feeling. And ultimately, you talk about the analytic process, the developmental analytic process. If you think about it in psychological typology, it's going from your primary function and coming to terms ultimately with your inferior function. And for a thinking type, the inferior function is feeling. You may never get there all the way, but if you can come into it and fall into that other, it's like fire going to water. It's an enantiodromia, a change from opposite of one to the opposite end of another. Or for an intuitive, it can be, moving from intuition to the sensate. Is that making sense?
It makes a lot of sense. It makes great sense. I just will ask real quick if you have a moment. Is
Go
there a
ahead.
judgment about, one might think veering from one extreme to the other has a cachet of being bad or unstable. Is there any judgment put on enantiodromia as a process, or is it really what you do at the
Well,
end?
it's like what you do with anything, right? So like I'm going to have a glass of brandy when I'm all done here, but I only going to have one. And the reason I'm only going to have one is because we drank it all last night. Well, there wasn't much last night either. But so look, with any of these things, it can be pathological, right? There are people who go from being a busy worker and whatever, businessman, et cetera, and decide what they really need to do is go out and eat raw meat in the desert or in the jungle or, God knows. It's like, it can be a pathological move from where you are. You're caught in one thing and you all of a sudden come to the image that I must be something else. And then you do it. And you do it with such pathological intensity that there's it's just that, it's pathological. But in a normal developmental process, you might find that this is what was needed. I mean, in my own, I'll just give you my own, I talked about the mountain climbing stuff. So I started the mountain climbing. I just, really at the end of my medical school. I mean, for years, I had been uptight, right? I mean, working hard at school, doing well in medical school, getting into the best residency, finishing off, going to work, all this head stuff. And I had it. I needed a change. And what was my change? It was highly pathological. I went mountain climbing. Every year I'd go off and climb big mountains, really big mountains, sometimes for months, with great danger of dying doing it. But that's what I had to do to get out of my head. I needed to be sensate. I needed to get my fingers into it, not to think about things, but to feel what it took to keep me alive in that environment. Well, it's an enantiodromia. Was it pathological? It would have been pathological if it would have killed me. But here I am. So I supposedly it was just a developmental phase. I hope that makes sense. Are we done, Christophe? Do we have time? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's the last question from Claire Julian. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And Lance, thank you so much for this offering. This is so important during this time in our history. And my question is about Mary. Jung wrote so much about validating the dogma of the Assumption and even the virgin birth, I think. And I'm just wondering, did he have a more direct relationship with her or experience of her? And how did that figure into the Aion or the New Age to come? How did he understand Mary being part of that process?
Gosh, I wish I had a picture to show you right now. Maybe I do. Hold on. Okay, here she comes. The big red book, page 155. I mean, usually I just do this on the computer screen. Okay, Claire Julian, can you see this?
Let me get just the speaker up on my thing here, and I probably, yes.
So this picture right here, that's Philemon. That's his logos figure in his internal development. This one is on page 155 of the red book, and you can find this image online somewhere. I'm not doing a very good job of showing it to you.
No, I could see it.
Yeah. So, and what does it say at the top of that? Oops. lost my page. It's in Latin, and you will know each and every one of these words. But it says, Dei sapientia in mysterium. The wisdom of God in mystery. And then across the top, where does it say it? The words are actually from the New Testament, and it's a, where does it say it? Oh, I can't find all the words here. My bifocal is on. But he talks really about this, the soul, the anima, in a form of a mysterium, and he uses words from the New Testament about the profundity of this thing. It really is, to say it's Marian would be to put it into a specific theological context of Catholicism that we are aware of. It's the divine feminine.
Yeah.
And here, if you look at her in this picture, you'll notice that she has a shower of golden light over her head, and that she has the moon beside her. And it's, well,
So-
if you want to look for an image in anything that he did, he painted that in 1924. He painted that picture of Philemon on the one page, and the Marian image, the Sapientia,
Wow,
the
wow.
glory. Yeah, and Sapientia means Sophia, right?
Yeah.
It's the Sophianic image of divine wisdom, which was so very, very, very important here. You know, the image of Sophia as the completion of the Logos, as the member of the Hieros Gamos, the mystical wedding. Even the divine mystical wedding was that between Logos and the feminine, Sapientia, Sophia, wisdom. And that, and I should also say that his master, Simon Magus, you know, in a prior incarnation, Simon Magus's wife was thought to be the incarnation of Sapientia, of Sophia. She was a Sophianic incarnation.
Wow.
And Magus, Simon Magus, who became Philemon, had a syzygy, and she was Sophia, Helena, the incarnation of feminine wisdom. So this idea of the conjunction of opposites, of the syzygy, of the mysterium conjunctionis, the holy wedding. Yeah, Jung knew about that stuff. Thank you.